There is a photograph that almost every household in Britain keeps somewhere in its memory, even the ones that never put a frame on the wall. A young man in a dark naval uniform, taller than he looks comfortable being, looking down at the ground. A young woman in ivory chiffon, smiling past the camera at something out of frame, a circlet of diamonds low on her forehead, a great sheaf of white roses in her arms. Westminster Abbey, late April, 1923. The caption beneath it, when there is one, is short and warm. The second son of George V married the daughter of the Earl of Strathmore, and the country wished them well. The caption omits a great deal. It omits that she had already refused him once and would refuse him again. It omits the letter in which she explained, in her own hand, that she was afraid of never being free to think, speak, and act as she felt she really ought. It omits the existence of another man, a decorated officer from one of the oldest families in Scotland, who was the second son's own equerry, and who, in the January after her first refusal, sailed for New York and an oil job in Oklahoma. It omits, because the world did not yet know it, that she would outlive her husband by more than half a century, and that, during those years, she would decide which letters survived and which were burned, which version of the marriage the public would be allowed to keep, and which would be sealed in archives for 79 years before the family finally let a chosen biographer inside. The photograph at the Abbey door is the first public image most people ever saw of her. It is also, in a way the country did not understand at the time and has never been encouraged to examine since, the first product of a long editorial project. To see why, you have to go back further than the Abbey. You have to go back to a Scottish castle, and to a girl whose 14th birthday fell on the day that Britain went to war. The castle was Glamis, in Angus, the ancestral seat of the Bowes-Lyon family, and the place where Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on the 4th of August, 1900. Her father was Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore, a Scottish peer of ancient lineage and modest income. Her mother was Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck, daughter of a clergyman, a woman who would produce 10 children in 11 years and outlive almost all of the sorrows that were about to enter the household. Elizabeth was the 9th. The family was aristocracy, not royalty, and no one in that house expected any daughter of it to marry into Buckingham Palace. They expected daughters to come out, to be courted, to make good matches, to marry well inside their own order. The older sisters had done exactly that, and the plan for Elizabeth was no different. On the morning of the 4th of August, 1914, she turned 14, and on the evening of the same day, Britain declared war on Germany. By Christmas, Glamis had been given to the war. The castle, vast and inconvenient and full of paneling that generations of servants had polished to a dark shine, was converted into a convalescent hospital within roughly 4 months of the declaration. The wounded came north from the front by train and by hospital ship, and the family moved into a handful of rooms and gave the rest to the men. Elizabeth was too young to be a nurse. The training was years away, and the regulations were not negotiable. What she could do, and what her mother set her to do almost at once, was the second tier of work that a hospital ward requires in order to function. She wrote letters home for men who could no longer hold a pen, and hands steadier than theirs, and spellings more certain. She fetched tobacco and cigarettes, played cards for small stakes with patients who could not bear the silence, sat for hours beside men who could not sleep. She learned their names, their regiments, their home villages. She remembered them. The men in those wards, in their turn, remembered her. The lesson of those months, although nobody framed it to her in these terms, was that charm is a form of labor with hours and results, and that the woman who learned to perform it on demand was a woman who would never be short of a role. She was 14. Her brother Fergus had joined up the moment the war began. He was 27, married barely a year, and on leave at Glamis for a few days in the late summer of 1915 before his unit went back out to France. Elizabeth saw him at home, and a few weeks later, in the middle of September, she received the telegram that said he had been killed at the Battle of Loos. He had no known grave. The country would later turn her private act of mourning at the Abbey door into a ritual repeated by every royal bride since, but the grief that lay beneath it was an old grief in a teenager's body, and it did not leave her. Another brother, Michael, was reported killed in 1917 and turned out to be a prisoner of war, alive after all. In 1916, a part of Glamis caught fire. Elizabeth was 16. She called the fire brigade and organized what could be carried out of the burning wing, and the family's later story was that she had been quite calm about it, that the servants had taken their cue from her. Whether she was in fact calm, or whether she simply refused to let anyone see that she was not, hardly matters, because the reputation was fixed then, and she never let it go, because it worked. By the time the war ended, she had a skill set that no finishing governess could have given her. She knew how to read a room. She knew how to make a man who was frightened or grieving feel that the room had a shape and that someone was in charge of it. She knew how to perform a steady, attentive warmth for hours on end without allowing the performance to show. The aristocratic charm Britain would later attribute to her temperament had begun in a converted ward in Angus as a job. The brothers did not all come home, and the young men of her generation did not all come home. And when she made her debut into a London season in the early months of 1919, the streets were full of women her own age whose dance cards would never be filled. She enjoyed being courted. Every account of those seasons, and there are several, agrees that she enjoyed it. The dresses, the attention, the small competitions between officers home on leave, and the longer list of men who would not be coming back. She had a lightness then that she never quite lost, and a capacity for flirtation that was taken at the time for what it was. The point worth holding, in the film's own reading of the record, is that the woman who would later be described as naturally warm and naturally poised had in fact been trained, very young, and without anyone quite intending it, in the labor of being precisely that. The training had been disguised as a wartime duty. It was, in retrospect, the first apprenticeship for the only job she would ever apply for. By 1920, when she met the man she would eventually marry, the apprenticeship was over and the tools were sharp. The country keeps the Abbey photograph because it wants a story with a single clear image: the shy prince and the smiling girl, the Abbey door, the white roses, the future king and queen of a Britain about to be tested. The story is not wrong. The affection in their letters, both of them, lasts to the end of his life and is real, and the film must say so without irony, because the courage of 1940 was not invented and the marriage was not a fraud. But the photograph is also, and has always been, the first frame of a longer sequence in which the woman at its center would be, in turn, the wife of a reluctant king, the queen of a bombed capital, the widow of 50 years, the proprietor of a sealed archive and a biographer-approved life, and the keeper of a set of decisions about what Britain would be allowed to know about all of it. The Abbey photograph is the beginning of that. It is not the whole of it. The country has been looking at the photograph and has been content with the caption for 100 years. The rest of the story is what happens when you take the caption off. In the summer of 1920, at a dance in London during Derby Week, a young woman from Angus who had been taught, in a converted ward, to look at a room and read it, met a young man who could not get a sentence out of his mouth. Prince Albert, Duke of York, was the second son of George V and Queen Mary. He was 24, taller than was convenient, and he had a stammer that had defeated every specialist his family had produced, and a temper that the family referred to by a private word and never wrote down. His elder brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, was the one the press followed. Edward was the heir, the glamour, the coming king. Bertie, as everyone in the family called him, was the spare, and he knew it. Every photograph of the brothers together, taken in those years, places Edward at the center and Bertie a half step behind. And Bertie did not need to be told what that meant. He had decided, almost as soon as the dance at Derby Week was over, that he wanted to marry the girl with the smile. He was not the only man who had decided something of the kind. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had, by that summer, an attachment of her own. James Stuart was the third son of the Earl of Moray, a decorated officer, and, this is the part that would later make the story awkward, Bertie's own equerry. The attachment was serious by her own letters and by later recollection, and the household at Glamis knew about it, and the household at St. James's Palace did not, exactly, but the right people knew enough. Stuart was close enough to Bertie to see him daily, and close enough to Elizabeth to be a real presence in her life. The two attachments sat side by side through the early months of 1920, and the family, in its way, was watching. Early in 1921, Bertie proposed. By several accounts, he did not do it in person but through an intermediary, which is itself a small piece of information about how the family taught its sons to behave with women of rank. Elizabeth refused. In a letter of March that year, she wrote that thinking about the prospect made her miserable, that she worried he would be unhappy, and she asked whether they might continue as friends. The objection she put on paper was about him. The objection she kept private was about the institution. She feared, as she put it in her own words, never again being free to think, speak, and act as she felt she really ought. She was not intimidated by the prince. She was intimidated by the palace behind him, and the film should say plainly that she was right to be. She was 24 years old, and she had already understood that the life of a royal duchess in 1921 was not a life of choice. Bertie told his mother, Queen Mary, that he would marry nobody else. In the autumn of that year, Queen Mary came north to Glamis. The visit had been arranged despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that Elizabeth's own mother was ill enough that she could not play hostess, and the 19-year-old daughter of the house took the duty on herself, with the help of her elder sister in the household. The menu, the seating, the timing of the calls, the small entertainments, all of it fell to a girl who had been running a convalescent ward at 14 and a county household at 20. By the account of Mabel, Countess of Airlie, one of Queen Mary's ladies-in-waiting and a sharp observer who would publish her recollections much later, Mary left Glamis convinced that this was the one girl who could make her second son happy, and decided, accordingly, not to interfere. The decision not to interfere was itself a form of intervention, because it cleared the path. It is worth holding in any honest account that the woman who would become the most consequential royal wife of the 20th century was approved, in the end, by the mother-in-law she had just cause to fear, and that the approval was won in the very rooms where, as a child, she had learned that charm is a job with hours. In January of 1922, James Stewart sailed from Liverpool for New York. The job he was taking was in the oil business in Oklahoma, and the offer had come to him through Sir Sidney Greville, a courtier whose sister served as one of Queen Mary's ladies-in-waiting. The chain is worth tracing because the film is required to be careful with this part of the story, and carefulness consists in keeping the documented, the attributed, and the inferred in separate piles. What is documented? Stewart was Bertie's equerry, the attachment to Elizabeth was serious, and in January 1922 he left for the United States. What is attributed to Stewart himself, decades later, when he was Viscount Stewart and had long outlived the moment, that Queen Mary had arranged for him to be removed. What is stated by the official biographer with access to the relevant archive, William Shawcross, that he found no documentary evidence for it. What is stated by Bertie himself much later, to his younger daughter Princess Margaret, was that her mother had nearly married Stewart, but that Stewart had gone abroad. The husband knew. The husband told it to his own child. The film does not know what passed between the young woman and her future mother-in-law, and will not pretend to. It will note only that the young woman was 24, the equerry was gone in a month, the next proposal came in March, and the chain has the shape that it has. Bertie proposed the second time on the 7th of March 1922, about a week after Elizabeth had been bridesmaid at her sister's marriage. He proposed in person this time. She refused again. The refusal did not close anything, because by then the houses at either end of the question had decided, even if the woman at the center of it had not. She accepted him, finally, on the 13th of January 1923, walking in the garden at St. Paul's, Waldenbury, the family house in Hertfordshire. His telegram to his parents, sent the same day, said only what was needed. "All right, Bertie." It was announced on the 16th of January. One London paper, misinformed about which brother was the suitor, ran the news as the engagement of Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon to the Prince of Wales. She gave a small number of press interviews in the days after the announcement, and gave them cheerfully, in her own words. The palace was appalled. Courtiers rebuked her, and the rebuke was the last lesson the family ever needed to teach her about the handling of the press. She did not give another press interview for the next 79 years. Not as Duchess, not as Queen, not through the war, not through the long widowhood, not once. The wedding was fixed for the 26th of April, 1923, at Westminster Abbey. Madame Handley Seymour made the dress, in ivory chiffon moire. Queen Mary lent the lace veil. The Abbey chapter refused a request from the BBC to broadcast the service. The reported objection, which has the ring of a real objection of its era, was that men in public houses might listen in without removing their hats. The congregation filled the Abbey. The bride entered on her father's arm, the Earl of Strathmore in his ceremonial dress, his daughter in white against the grey stone of the nave. As she passed the grave of the unknown warrior, she stopped, set her bouquet of white roses on the stone, and stood for a moment with her head bowed. It was not on the program. It was her own idea. It was for Fergus, killed at Luce in September 1915, married barely a year, home on leave days before he went back. There was no known grave. The cameras caught it, the newsreels carried it around the world within hours, and every royal bride since has done something at the same grave. Because the gesture worked. The film is required to treat this as the whole method, visible in her first 15 minutes of public life, and it is required to resist making it cynical. It was sincere, and it was perfectly judged, and those two things are not in conflict. A private grief, performed in front of the world, with the press already in position to carry it. The country wanted to weep. The bride gave it permission. The bride had been trained to give permission, in a ward in Glamis, for men who needed it. The Abbey door photograph, in other words, is not a portrait of a shy prince rescued by a warm woman. It is the first frame of a much longer film in which a woman who had twice refused the job and stated, on paper, her reasons, finally agreed to take it on terms she had been allowed, in the end, partly to set. She did not enter a life of choice. She entered a life in which the choice was whether to be warm in private or warm in public. And she chose public. And she chose to control which version of warm the public would receive. The white roses on the unknown warrior's grave were the first product of that choice. And the silence that began with the courtier's rebuke in the spring of 1923 was the second. The honeymoon was spent at Polesden Lacey in Surrey, lent to the couple by Mrs. Ronnie Greville, a brewery heiress and one of the great society hostesses of her generation, whose house was the kind of house in which a junior member of the royal family could be looked after without fuss. The Greville drawing room had been decorated for a woman who entertained ambassadors and prime ministers as a matter of course, and the young couple were put up there as guests, which is a particular kind of beginning to a marriage, being accommodated rather than accommodated by. From Surrey, the new Duchess of York went north to Glamis, contracted whooping cough, and wrote to a friend that the start of married life had been thoroughly unromantic. She was 26, her husband was almost 30. Neither of them had anywhere to live. The first marital home was White Lodge in Richmond Park, given to them by George V and furnished, with very particular attention to the contents of every drawer, by Queen Mary. White Lodge had been Queen Mary's own childhood home, which is the reason it was chosen for her daughter-in-law. The house was damp, expensive to heat, and inconveniently far from the center of London, set back behind its own parkland and serviced by a road that turned treacherous in winter. And the Yorks disliked it from the first week and began almost at once the long, quiet work of maneuvering to leave it. The furniture had been laid in by a woman who believed that a house was an instrument of moral instruction. You could open a drawer and find it arranged, and you could feel, closing the drawer again, that you had been given a small exam. They moved in 1927 to a rented townhouse at 145 Piccadilly, which is where they would live, with no property of their own in any direction, until the succession crisis of 1936 gave them something else. The film is required to keep this detail visible, because it is part of the formation. A young woman who had come from owning land since the Reformation, whose family had sat on the same stone since the 1400s, was now a tenant, on a husband who was a tenant, under a father-in-law who gave the houses and a mother-in-law who filled them. The leverage of the formation lay precisely there. A woman who had been raised to expect a roof of her own was being shown, in slow installments, what it meant to live in the gift of others. George V, who ruled his family the way he had been taught to rule ships, with shouting, with punctuality, and with a discipline that did not recognize that his sons were grown men, was nevertheless, by every account, charmed into softness by his new daughter-in-law. He terrorized his own children. He terrified Bertie. The Yorks learned to arrive for family dinners early and to leave them on the king's word, not on the clock. When Elizabeth arrived late to dinner one evening, the king told her that she was not late at all. The household, he said, must have sat down early. His own children could not have got away with breathing loudly. She had found the leverage, and the leverage was not power. The leverage was access. By being easy to be charmed by, she ensured that the king would give her the kind of attention that he gave almost no one, and that he would, in the long run, give her the things she asked for. The lesson she had learned at 14, in the convalescent ward at Glamis, that charm was a job with hours and results, was being applied now to a king rather than to a patient with a missing arm. The technique was the same. The outcome was the same. Bertie's stammer was the fact of his working life. He had been humiliated by it in public, most painfully at the closing of the Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1925, where the family's response had been the rotation of specialists and the father who told him to spit it out. The instruction to spit it out, reported from those who heard it, was not unkindly meant. It was simply the only model of correction the king had for a son who could not perform. In October 1926, on the insistence of his wife, he went to an Australian named Lionel Logue, who had no medical qualifications, no establishment credentials, and a practice on Harley Street built on the treatment of shell-shocked soldiers and provincial elocution students. Logue's consulting rooms were on the second floor above a chemist's shop. The Duchess, who had been raised in a castle, walked past the brass plate herself. Logue's own notes record that she sat in on the early sessions, in a straight-backed chair against the wall, watching her husband repeat vowels at a man who had no business treating a king's son, and who had been hired to do so over the heads of every establishment physician who had failed. She had bypassed, by arranging it herself, the entire royal medical apparatus that had failed her husband for a decade. Within months, Bertie could address thousands. The work that matters for the film is not the work that the film The King's Speech made famous, although that work was real and the outcome was real. The work that matters is the active decision behind it. A young duchess with no official standing, hiring an outsider over the heads of the household and getting away with it, because the king had been charmed into letting her. Their elder daughter was born on the 21st of April, 1926, by cesarean section at the maternal grandparents' house in Bruton Street. The official bulletin on the door spoke only, in the careful language of the period, of a certain line of treatment having been adopted. The Home Secretary, Sir William Joynson Hicks, sat through the night in a house in Mayfair, waiting to verify the existence of the child. The verification was a formality of state, performed every time an heir was born, and it required a minister of the Crown to be physically present in a neighboring room until the child had been inspected by the obstetrician and the placenta disposed of. 9 months later, with the baby left behind in England under the care of a nurse and a grandmother, the Yorks sailed for Australia and New Zealand on a tour that was to last 6 months and that included the opening of the new Parliament House in Canberra. Elizabeth was reportedly distressed on the morning of departure. One account has the car being driven around the block more than once, and her needing to be coaxed out. She was a young mother, leaving an infant daughter for half a year, and the distress was not performed. The tour was a government-ordered tour, and she had no choice but to make it. In Canberra, in May of 1927, Bertie delivered a speech that did not collapse. He wrote home, crediting his wife. The Australian papers wrote that the Duchess was the real attraction. The tour established, in a way that no interview could have done, what she was for, and she had not had to say a word. The second daughter, Margaret Rose, was born at Glamis in August of 1930, the first royal birth in Scotland in centuries, and the location was not arranged for the baby's comfort, but for the photograph. The Home Secretary for this one was J.R. Clines, who sat in a Scottish house for 2 weeks waiting in lodgings arranged for him at the castle gates. The following year, the Yorks were granted Royal Lodge and Windsor Great Park, in poor condition, with damp plaster and a roof that needed work, and Elizabeth restored it herself, room by room, and it became, for the first time in the marriage, a house she had made into something. She kept it for the rest of her life. Royal Lodge is the first address in the story that was hers. George V died in January of 1936, and the Prince of Wales became Edward VIII. The American woman with whom Edward was, by then, conducting an affair that the government could not pretend not to know about was Wallis Simpson, twice divorced or in process of divorce. The catalogue of anecdotes about the Duchess of York's view of Simpson reaches us through the memoirs of interested parties, and the film should not put more on them than they will bear. The mockery at Fort Belvedere is reported. The cold reception is reported. The phrase that Simpson was not that woman, but the woman, in a tone that left no doubt, is reported. What is also on the record is that, in the correspondence of the crisis, the Duchess was not warm. She regarded the situation as a catastrophe inflicted on her husband by his brother's self-interest. Through the decisive days of December 1936, as Edward negotiated his departure from Fort Belvedere and Bertie prepared to take the throne he had never been trained for, she was in bed at 145 Piccadilly with influenza. It was the most consequential fortnight of her life, and she was off stage. The abdication instrument was signed on the 10th of December. Bertie acceded as George VI the next day, taking his father's name in a deliberate signal of continuity, and kept the coronation date that Edward had booked, the 12th of May, 1937, so that the invitations, the seating plan, the music, the anthem, the route, and the abbey itself would not have to be redrawn by a household that had just lost its king. She had spent 13 years learning, under Queen Mary's roof and rules, what a royal life demanded and how its machinery of public communication worked. She had done it without an interview, without a press statement, without a single published word of her own. She had done it by looking at rooms, by remembering names, by being visibly warm in the right places at the right time. She had done it by sitting in on her husband's sessions with an Australian outsider on Harley Street, and by charming a king who terrified his sons into giving her the access that her position did not formally allow. In 1937, she would be crowned. The woman who had twice refused the family would become its center. The Duchess, who had been a tenant in her own home, would become queen, and would, for the rest of her life, be photographed as if she had always been one. The coronation was on the 12th of May, 1937, in Westminster Abbey, with the same invitations that had been issued for Edward, and the same arrangements that Edward's staff had booked, and with a different king and a different queen at its center. She was crowned beside her husband. The Duke of Windsor watched the broadcast from France, and in June of that year married Wallis Simpson in a ceremony at which no member of the British royal family was present. The question of style was settled on the 27th of May by letters patent, which granted the Duke of Windsor the style Royal Highness, but explicitly withheld it from his wife and from any issue of the marriage. The Duke called the act a mean one and never got over it. The letters patent remained, for the rest of his life, the public record of what his sister-in-law thought of his choice. She had, in a single sentence of official typography, fixed the line between a brother and a brother-in-law, and the line was to be reproduced in every reference book from that day forward. The money was uglier still. During the settlement of the abdication, Edward had pleaded relative poverty, and George VI had accepted the plea and made provision accordingly. In time, the new king established that his brother had been considerably better provided for than he had allowed him to believe. The former king had misrepresented his finances to the current one, and the discovery poisoned what remained of the fraternal bond. From Austria, and later from France, Edward kept ringing Buckingham Palace with advice about the job he had just abandoned. The calls were eventually stopped. Philip Ziegler, the official biographer of the Duke of Windsor with access to the relevant archive, has laid this out in detail. The film is required to remember that she watched her husband absorb all of it while learning a job he had never been trained for, with a speech impediment that could still betray him, in the year that Europe began to fall apart. The household at 145 Piccadilly, which had been a London townhouse rented since 1927, was now a small court preparing for the job of state. The staff were inherited. The habits were not. On the 30th of September, 1938, Neville Chamberlain came back from Munich with an agreement and a piece of paper. Before reporting to Parliament, before the elected House had heard a word, the King and Queen brought Chamberlain onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace to be cheered by a crowd that had gathered in the dark. It had never been done before. The constitutional monarch placed the visible endorsement of the Crown behind one Prime Minister's contested policy in advance of parliamentary debate. Her own correspondence was warm about what Chamberlain had achieved. Within a year, the policy was rubble, and within 2, the country was at war. Constitutional historians have found the balcony awkward, and the film is required to say so factually, and is required not to do more than say so factually. The Crown has, on other occasions, lent its visibility to governments. What was unusual in September 1938 was the timing. The Crown did not wait for Parliament. The film's reading is that the choice was a misjudgment, and that the misjudgment belongs to a couple who were still feeling their way into a job for which they had been unprepared. Chamberlain's piece of paper waved from the cockpit of an aeroplane was already a year old when the balcony happened. The photograph of the 3 figures on the balcony was, at the time, meant to close a chapter. The country understood it as the beginning of one. In June of 1939, the King and Queen crossed to Canada and into the United States. George VI was the first reigning British sovereign ever to set foot in the United States, and the strategic purpose of the visit was blunt. The Crown had to make Americans like a monarchy their own country was founded on rejecting. Franklin Roosevelt took them to Hyde Park and served them hot dogs at a picnic, and the King asked, with perfect seriousness, how one was meant to eat the thing. The crowds in Washington and New York were enormous. Roosevelt and the King talked late into the night, in the language of men who shared a profession, about the Atlantic, about destroyers, about what America might be persuaded to do. By every reporter who covered the visit, the most effective diplomatic asset Britain sent abroad in that decade was the Queen, and she had done it without speeches, because she had not given a press interview in 16 years and was not about to start. She had done it with the things she had learned at 14 in the convalescent ward in Glamis. Look at people, remember names, never appear hurried. The American reporters, who would have torn an interview apart, found that they could not write a hostile word about a woman who made them feel, in person, that she had been waiting for them. The Hyde Park picnic photograph, with its paper plates and the king working out a hot dog in plain daylight, did more for the Anglo-American relationship than any communique of the previous decade. It also did more for the monarchy, at home, than any document the palace had issued since the letters patent of the 27th of May. The war came, and the country would very shortly tell itself a story about how the king and queen had met it. The story would be true in important parts. It would be untrue in others. It would be partly invented, by no one in particular, and repeated for 80 years because it was too good to check. In the meantime, on the balcony of Buckingham Palace on the night of the 3rd of September 1939, the couple stood as Chamberlain read out the terms of the British declaration of war against Germany, in a country that had voted, in 1931, to take leave of the Stuarts and the Bowes-Lyons alike, looked at a photograph of the new king and queen and read in it what it needed to read. She had, by the autumn of 1939, been inside the royal family for 16 years. She had spent those years learning, without a single public word of her own, how a photograph worked and how a crowd worked, and how a country could be made to feel that a woman on a balcony was one of them. The country was about to need every ounce of that. The country did not yet know what it would be told. Britain went to war in September of 1939. And over the next 12 months, the country built the version of its Queen Mother that has been, with very little alteration, the version ever since. Almost all of that version is true. The version is also incomplete, and the way it is incomplete is itself part of the story. Buckingham Palace was bombed on the 13th of September 1940. She was reported, afterwards, to have said that being hit meant she could look the East End in the face. She walked through the wrecked streets in pale coats and matching hats, dressed, by deliberate instruction to Norman Hartnell, in colors that would be visible against the rubble. She refused to send her daughters to Canada, although the government had asked her to. These things happened, and they mattered, and the country was right to remember them. What the country was not told, in the form it remembered them, was how the rest of the war was spent. The king and queen were driven, on most nights through most of the Blitz, out of London to Windsor and back again in the morning. The schedule said they commuted. The story said they stayed. Their daughters spent the war at Windsor Castle and not in the capital, and this was not cowardice and it was not disgrace, but it was not the story either. The palace was bombed 9 times during the war. The king and queen were incited on at least one of those occasions, and incited on at least one of those occasions is a different sentence from incited every night. The difference between those two sentences is the space in which myth is manufactured. The line about looking the East End in the face was not a speech. It was a sentence from a private letter, written by her to Queen Mary. It was a private sentence, and it became a public sentence because somebody decided to release it. And the decision about which private sentence the public would receive was itself a piece of editorial work. The country was not told that the sentence existed, in 1940, in the form in which the country now repeats it. The country was told the sentence because a person, in a position to do so, decided that the country should have it. The choice of that sentence, out of all the sentences that might have been chosen, was a choice about what the war would mean in memory. Then there was the line that was not a sentence from any letter, and not a sentence from any speech, and that nevertheless sat at the head of the version for 80 years. The country was told that Hitler had called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. There is no primary source for the remark. It appears in no German record. It appears in no captured document, no intercepted transmission, no interrogation transcript, no memoir by anyone who served in the Reich, no post-war archive opened in Berlin or anywhere else. It is a compliment the British public paid itself, attributed to a convenient villain, repeated because it was too good to check. The film is required to say this plainly, because the line is the clearest example in the story of a national myth attaching itself to a woman who had spent the war doing everything she could to make sure that what attached to her was in the end what she and her advisors had approved. 3 layers, then, in the war story, and they should be held apart. There is the genuine courage, which was real, and the country's gratitude for it, which was not misplaced. There is the managed myth, in which the king and queen were presented as more continuously present in the bombed capital than they in fact were, and in which a private sentence was released to do work that a speech would not have done as well. And there is the decorative layer, that nobody in particular planted, and that took root because the country wanted a symbol and was prepared to invent one. All three at once, and all three made possible by a woman who knew, in the autumn of 1939, exactly how a photograph works. The war ended. Her husband was 50 years old and looked older. He had smoked heavily since adolescence, and the decades of tobacco had done their work. By 1948, he had arteriosclerosis in his legs, the narrowing of the arteries severe enough that the surgeons had begun to discuss amputation. In March of 1949, he underwent a lumbar sympathectomy, a surgical procedure intended to restore blood flow by interrupting the nerve supply to the affected vessels. It bought time. It did not solve the problem. In May of 1951, a shadow was found on his left lung. In September of that year, the diagnosis was carcinoma. He was not told. On the 23rd of September, 1951, surgeons removed his entire left lung in a room at Buckingham Palace that had been converted into an operating theater. The bulletin placed on the palace gates that afternoon spoke of structural changes. The language was chosen with precision. Structural changes suggested something architectural, something that could be repaired or managed. It did not suggest cancer, and it did not suggest death. And the king was allowed to believe, throughout the months that remained, that the trouble was inflammatory. The word cancer was withheld from him and from the public, and, as a reassessment published in the journal Cardiovascular Pathology in 2021 has documented, from much of the medical profession that was nominally caring for him. His wife was inside the circle that made the decision. The standard medical practice of the period was to shield a patient from a terminal diagnosis, and the film is required to note that she was following her doctors, and that there is no reason to doubt she believed she was protecting him. The film is also required to say, plainly, what the record contains when the manners are stripped. A man was told a story about his own body by the people closest to him, and the story was not true, and he died inside it. The decision to withhold the diagnosis was not unusual for the time. The decision was also not hers alone, but she was party to it, and she did not object, and the man who had proposed 3 times and been refused twice, and had told his mother he would marry no one else, died without knowing what was killing him. On the 31st of January, 1952, he stood on the tarmac at London Airport, bareheaded in the cold, watching his elder daughter fly to Kenya with her husband. The photographs from that afternoon are hard to look at. The man is visibly ill. The skin is gray. The suit hangs. The wife is beside him, composed, gloved, doing what she had learned to do in a convalescent ward in Angus in 1914, stand next to someone who is suffering and make it look as though everything is under control. 6 days later, on the 6th of February, he died in his sleep at Sandringham of coronary thrombosis at the age of 56. She was 51. The widow had 50 years ahead of her, and a daughter on her way back from Kenya to become queen, and a son-in-law whose letters from Sandringham over the coming days would describe what those first hours had been like. The country would, within weeks, begin to compose its official grief. She had, by the winter of 1952, been inside the royal family for almost 29 years. She had refused the institution twice and then joined it, and she had spent every year of her membership learning its communications from the inside, without ever giving a press interview, without ever publishing a word, without ever allowing a sentence of her own to enter the public record, except as she or someone acting for her had approved. She had been rebuked by courtiers in 1923 for speaking to a newspaper in her own words, and she had never made that mistake again. She was, by the time of the tarmac and the death at Sandringham, the most powerful private editor of public sentiment in the country. The next 50 years would be the working life of that editor. The country did not know that yet. The country was looking at a photograph of a man on a tarmac and a widow and a story it had been told. The first months were bad enough that Winston Churchill was reportedly asked to intervene. She withdrew to Scotland. On the exposed Caithness coast, facing Orkney across a stretch of water that the wind never stops crossing, she saw a wreck of a 16th century castle called Barragill, which had been scheduled for demolition. She bought it in 1952. She spent 3 years restoring it and renamed it the Castle of May. It was the first property she had ever owned, not lent by a mother-in-law, not granted by a king, not attached to an office. Hers, bought with her own money, 600 miles from London, with no royal associations at all. She went every August and every October for the rest of her life, and the going was the part of the year she kept most carefully for herself. White Lodge in Richmond Park had been George V's gift. 145 Piccadilly had been rented. Royal Lodge at Windsor had been granted in 1931, the year before her husband came to the throne. The Castle of May is the second address in the story that was hers, and the first that nobody could take from her. Then she went back to work on the past. John Wheeler Bennett was appointed to write the official life of George VI, and the biography was published in 1958 with the full cooperation of the Queen Mother and with full oversight of what was to appear in it. It was a good book. It was also a controlled book, and it fixed for the next half-century the accepted shape of the marriage and the reign. The reluctant, dutiful brother who had done his duty and been killed, before his time, by the strain of a crown he had never wanted. A story of that shape required a villain, and named one. The villain was still alive, in France, with an American wife who had never been granted the 3 letters she believed she should have been granted, and the 2 of them were the convenient explanation for everything that had gone wrong. The letters patent of the 27th of May, 1937, had granted the Duke of Windsor the style Royal Highness, and explicitly withheld it from his wife and any descendants. The Duke had called it a mean act, and had never got over it. The money had been uglier still. During the abdication settlement, Edward VIII had pleaded relative poverty to his brother. George VI later established that the former king had been considerably better provided for than he had let on, and the discovery had poisoned what fraternal feeling remained. The Duke's official biographer, Philip Ziegler, writing with archive access, had laid it out. The abdication had left wreckage, financial and fraternal, and the official life of George VI placed the blame where the Queen Mother had always believed it belonged. The Duke of Windsor died in 1972. His body was brought home for burial at Frogmore. Elizabeth, who had been the Queen Mother for 20 years, and who had, for 36 of those years, refused to be photographed in the same room as his wife, walked with Wallis Simpson at Windsor in front of the cameras. The 2 women who had not been in the same frame for a generation were, that afternoon, in the same frame. The picture was on every front page. Whether the walk was a reconciliation or a piece of stage management was a question the photograph was designed to make it pointless to ask. The widow had decided what the country would see, and the country saw it. The papers were harder to control than the photographs. In her last years at Royal Lodge, Princess Margaret burned tranches of family correspondence, including, by the account of the official biographer who later had access to the surviving archive, letters relating to the Windsors. The destruction was not a loss. It was a destruction, carried out with the family's knowledge, by the daughter of the woman whose reputation the letters concerned. The film is required to hold the fact without commentary, because the commentary would be cheap, and the fact speaks for itself. In a house that had been run for 70 years as an editorial project, the burning of papers at the end was simply the project being completed in a different medium. What survived was what had been permitted to survive. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March, 2002, at the age of 101. Her will was sealed by order of the High Court, and a later legal challenge to open it was dismissed. The official biography did not appear until 2009, 7 years after her death, written with unrestricted access to her papers by William Shawcross, a biographer chosen by the family that owned the archive. Shawcross's book is a serious book. It is also the book the family permitted. The film is required to say so plainly, because the point is not to diminish the book, but to place it. 7 years between the death and the publication. 7 years in which no other historian was granted access. 7 years in which the archive remained a family possession, the contents of which were disclosed at the family's discretion and through a writer of the family's choosing. The film states the fact because the film is required to state what the facts are. 3 layers then, and they are worth keeping apart, as they had been kept apart all along. There is the documented, the deaths, the biographies and their publication dates, the sealing of the will, the dismissal of the legal challenge, the burning of the papers, the purchase of the Castle of May, the walk with the Duchess of Windsor at Windsor. The dates are fixed. The Castle of May was bought in 1952. Wheeler Bennett's biography was published in 1958. Her brother-in-law's death came in 1972. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March, 2002. Shawcross's biography was published in 2009. These are the anchors, and the film returns to them because they do not move. There is the attributed, the recollections of Mabel, Countess of Airlie, on Queen Mary's visit to Glamis. James Stuart's own later claim, as Viscount Stuart of Findhorn, that Queen Mary had him removed. What George VI told Princess Margaret about her mother's earlier attachment to Stuart, and the limits that Shawcross states for what the archive supports. Stuart's claim appeared in his own memoir. Airlie's recollections were published in 1962. The king's remark to his daughter was reported secondhand. The film is required to treat each as what it is, a recollection, not a finding, told by someone with a memory and a position. And there is the film's own reading, which the film is required to state as a reading and not as a finding, that a woman who had been given a lesson in 1923 about who controlled information spent the following 79 years applying that lesson, and that the application was, on the evidence, remarkably successful. The lesson had come in the form of a rebuke. She had given press interviews cheerfully after the engagement was announced in January 1923, and the palace had been appalled. Courtiers had rebuked her. She never gave another press interview for the next 79 years, not as Duchess of York, not as Queen. The war years had not shifted it either, not through widowhood, not once. The film holds the fact because the fact is the pattern. It is worth saying in closing what the application was not. It was not a fraud of affection. The affection in the letters between Elizabeth and Bertie is real, and lasts to the end of his life. It was not a fraud of courage. The courage of 1940 was not invented. The film has said so throughout, and says so again. The bomb that struck Buckingham Palace on the 13th of September 1940 was real. The 9 bombings of the palace were real. The walks through wrecked streets in pale coats were real. And Norman Hartnell had been instructed that morning colors would not do. It is not a sneer at the monarchy. The subject of the film is the management of information by a single woman inside the institution, and not the institution's legitimacy. And the film holds to that subject because the subject is what the archive supports. What the archive supports is this: a woman who refused the throne twice and said in her own hand, why? The first refusal came in early 1921. The second came on the 7th of March 1922. The reason, in her own words, written in March 1921, was the fear of never again being free to think, speak, and act as she felt she really ought. A woman who then took the job and ran its communications for 30 years, deciding which sentence from a private letter became a national slogan and which photograph became the front page. The sentence about looking the East End in the face came from a private letter to Queen Mary. It was never a speech. Someone released it, and the release was a decision made by somebody about which private sentence the public should receive. A woman who was inside the circle that decided what her husband was told about his own body, and who, at the end of his life, was among those who decided he would be told a story that was not true. The bulletin on the palace gates in September 1951 spoke of structural changes. The word cancer was withheld from the king, from the public, and, according to a reassessment published in Cardiovascular Pathology in 2021, from much of the medical profession. A woman who then spent 50 years as a widow commissioning the official version, outliving every rival, and leaving an archive that had been curated, in part burned, and finally sealed by court order, to be opened in 2009 by a writer chosen by the family that owned it. The Abbey photograph of April 1923, the one the country keeps, is legible now, at the end of the story, as the first frame of that sequence. It is the start of a 79-year editorial project, and the project is what survived. Britain remembers a woman it believes it loved. What it is actually remembering is a set of decisions she made about what would survive.